On Friday, voters will go to the polls to decide on whether to remove or to keep the 8th Amendment from our Constitution.
Order! Can you not see it's order?
This was the most historically divisive issue in Ireland ever.
We've waited 35 years. We've just 1 week to do it, and we're going to bring it home.
Women are still travelling, women are still in danger.
This government needs to protect women's lives.
We absolutely have to do something.
What they're trying to do is take God out of society.
Sadly, the answer is, well, just get rid of it, instead of, what do you need?
There was that sense that women couldn't be trusted.
And I think the women of Ireland have rolled over for long enough.
Why can't I love glitz and glamour and still feel passionately about women's rights? Imagine if you could get this army of women putting that pressure on and to feel empowered.
Something magical happened where it became a symbol of women's equality in Ireland.
All these stories being somehow set free to try and change the country.
It's actually about the value that we're putting on women in Irish society.
People do recognise it's a kind of a backlash. What happens here in Ireland will have a knock-on effect.
We are creating an Ireland which values women, our bodies, our choices, ourselves, our lives, absolutely equally.
Hello everyone, my name is Sarah Mosses and I'm the founder and CEO of Together Films, and I am extremely proud to welcome you to today's panel. We're distributing a wonderful feature documentary called The 8th across UK cinemas at the moment in partnership with our friends at Breakout Pictures in Ireland. Hoping that you've seen the film already before this conversation, but I'm sure you'll have a really engaging and interesting time if you haven't yet seen the film. This evening's conversation, we're going to be looking at the power of protest and what we can learn from the victorious Irish abortion campaign and the wins that the Yes campaign secured just 3 years ago in the Irish referendum vote. This conversation, we're going to look at sort of what happened in that campaign, what can we learn from that campaign, what can we apply towards other kind of issues that we're fighting today. And I am thrilled with the incredible panel that we're going to have here with us. First up, we have Jess Philips, who is a British politician, serving as a Member of Parliament for Birmingham Yardley since 2015. And as a member of the Labour Party, she's been the Shadow Minister for Domestic Violence and Safeguarding in Keir Starmer's opposition frontbench since 2020. Welcome, Jess. Alongside Jess, we have Pragna Patel, who is a founding member and director of the Southall Black Sisters, an advocacy and campaigning centre established in 1979 to meet the needs of Black minority women, and the bulk of their work is directed at assisting women and children to obtain effective protection and assert their fundamental human right in the face of gender-based violence and related problems. And for those who've seen the film, Ailbhe Smyth will need no introduction. If you haven't yet seen The 8th, Ailbhe is a long-time activist and campaigner on feminist, LGBT and socialist issues from Ireland. And she was a founding head of the Women's Studies at UCD. Welcome, ladies, to today's conversation. Absolutely thrilled to have you here today. So I'm also, just for everyone listening in the crowd today, thrilled to be having this conversation with such incredible kind of fierce ladies to talk about these issues, because I feel like what you've all done in your collective work is so powerful, and it's just such an honour to be in a room with you to kind of talk about these issues. So let's start, Ailbhe, with you as the kind of main subject in the film. What role did protests play in getting that yes to happen in the campaign?
Oh, well, I think it was absolutely central. It was the root and base and backbone and spine of the whole thing. I was actually thinking, I'm not a sentimental person, and I don't normally cry at things very much. But there's a bit in the trailer that I always sort of feel, oh God, I'm almost going to cry. And it's the bit just before the women go out on the bridge dressed in their Handmaid's Tale. There's a huge big surge of them. And I think the reason is that I just feel that as a huge moment of women seizing that power, the power to stand up and say, we don't care. This is what we want, and we're going to take it. We're going to seize it. So I think that repeal couldn't have happened without protest. It couldn't have happened without the stamping of feet, the marching on the streets, the shouting, the pushing the politicians, due respect to Jess there, but also all the politicians who are on our side, getting them out on the streets as well and moving them to protest. So yeah, absolutely, hugely central, hugely.
Pivotal. Pragna, can you tell us a little bit more about your work at Southall Black Sisters and what you do, and how protest has been a part of your mission over the last few years as well?
Well, all right. So Southall Black Sisters was born out of protests. It was born in the midst of protests, and the protests that I'm referring to are the 1979 protests against racism and fascism on the streets of Southall and elsewhere. And the community of Southall, where we're located, came out to defend itself against the prospect of the National Front, which is a far-right movement, from marching through the streets of Southall, spreading their hate in this kind of really racially provocative way. And Black women, by which I mean women of many different ethnic backgrounds who politically describe themselves Black, were part of the anti-racist movement, were working alongside men, working alongside community activists, community leaders, practically, everyone, young and old. It was one of those rare moments of community unity out on the streets to defend the community from the racists and the fascists. And of course, it was policed badly. It was oppressively policed, which added another dimension to the experiences of the community in relation to institutional racism. But out of that formed Southall Black Sisters, which is a group of Black women of many diverse backgrounds who came together to carve out a space for women, because women were invisible. Black women were invisible. Black minority women are completely invisible, certainly in the wider society in those days, but also within the community due to patriarchal power, patriarchal relations, and even within the anti-racist movement. There was no space for women to talk about how their experiences of racism were also gendered, And so Southall Black Sisters was formed as an autonomous group located within wider social justice movements, but as an autonomous group to challenge the patriarchy within community, within society, to challenge racism, to actually challenge inequality of all kinds based on class, race, gender, sexuality, and so on. So for us, our very inception, if you like, was an act of dissent. And I think protest and dissent are two very kind of twin concepts, are twin things. They happen together. And so, I think the compulsion for us to challenge the kind of invisibility of women in the anti-racist movement, the invisibility of race, and just to challenge some of those things requires an act of dissent, requires us to dissent against the institutionalized forms of oppression, but also the orthodoxies of our own movements that often have blind spots. And so, for Southall Black Sisters, protest and providing services, which is what we do on a daily basis to women who arrive at our doors experiencing all forms of gender-based violence, go hand in hand. We hang on for dear life to the idea that you provide services to meet individuals, women's material needs, but you need to protest if you want to bring about lasting change. And the two have to happen simultaneously and together, and not to lose sight of the wider need to protest, precisely because of what Ailbhe says. Because, at the end of the day, what have we got but our voices? Mm-hmm. What have we got but our voices of dissent? And that is what protest is, isn't it? It's about raising our voices and being visible in raising our voices, and through that kind of reclaiming, sort of expressing our power, our collective power. So I think it's all of those things, and that's what we try to hold on to at Southall Black Sisters.
I love it. And I love that that's kind of like your founding identity was in that form of protest. And also when you reflect there on sort of the intersectionality, like you have to kind of increase awareness and support on this side to help this happen. And so many of the issues that many of us are protesting against at the moment are so very connected, because the issues of racism, gender-based violence, kind of or women's rights, they're so connected that if we can try and sort of bring about change in one, hopefully it will encourage in others. And this idea that sort of it is our right and it is our only way to make change, essentially to dissent against what is happening, is what is also currently potentially under threat. And I think that's what many of us are really concerned about at the moment, that we're in a very fragile place. And Jess, I'd love to come to you on this kind of next point, because we understand, many of us, that the right to protest is our human right, it's our freedom of speech, it's our cultural purpose. If something isn't right, we have to kind of shout about it. And many of us have been hearing about this change in the policing bill and how this will affect protests. I wonder, for those who maybe aren't as well versed in what that bill means, could you give us a top line in just very simple terms? What's at stake? What's the concern? What is changing that everybody's worried about?
Well, the fundamental of the bill, although if I were a Conservative politician, I would say something completely different about what the content of the bill actually says. But there is a fundamental in it that is almost, it is essentially trying to cause a row. Actually, its first line of defence is to start the row about protests anyway, and to put so much weight onto, for example, it's a much broader bill. It's a massive piece of legislation that is about all of the way that our courts works, all of the way that we police things, all of the ways that we sentence things, and yet there is so much focus on statues, for example, and this is in there in order almost to incite and to cause a row, to make people have a bit of a ruck about it. Now, the legislation actually, they would say, it's trying to do is stop protest at the point that it stops people getting to work and things like that. But it's not, we're not saying don't protest, is what they would say. But there's actually a line in the bill that is essentially that my two favourite things that were in the bill is, one, there's genuinely a line about criminalising when ministers can't get their cars in and out of Westminster, like Crimea River, you can't get your car in and out of Westminster, like go round, get on the tube. And there's another bit in it that is like anything that is annoying. Essentially, the threshold for criminality and protest it seems to be essentially like if it's annoying, which, I mean, I said to the ministers when they first tabled it, I can just be annoying inside the building. So what are you going to do? You're going to arrest me. But and when you have a vague piece of legislation like that, for those of us who seek power through protest, and that is not a niche group of people, that is pretty much 90% of the population's rights and roles in the world have been achieved through protest. Like nothing progressive ever happened without a couple of people in the back room of either a church or some pub back room going, hang on, I'm a bit pissed off about this, let's do something about it. And it builds. And the best protests like the ones that Pragna is talking about, and absolutely like the repeal, capture the emotions and the story, and that's why they go on to be successful and long lasting. But the reality is that for most of us, the way to get our voice heard and to get things to change is through the power of protest. And for those of us who are in that category, we know what vagaries in the law can feel like, because we felt the harsh end of vagaries in the law, like, oh, the women of Ireland have got perfect rights, so they're luckiest women in the world, or actually black women in our country and in Southall, that it's much better than it is in New Mexico, or that we've been taught. Powerful people use vagaries all the time to try and make those of us who rely on protest sort of grateful all the time, and that vagary will be used against us, like the way it gets used against that policing can be used against different groups. Women's responses from criminal justice agencies are completely different to that of men's responses from criminal justice agencies. And so we know what a vague element in the law feels like, because we always feel the harsh end of it. And so that is why, for those of us who know that things only are changed and achieved through protest, don't, you know, it's not enough to say, like, oh, if you're a bit annoying on my way to work, that you can't do that anymore. It's just, it's not, you know, they will say, oh, it's only the very worst cases. And we would say, but you're going to put us all in that category.
Yeah, I think that's the terrible thing here as well, because I think that was the point that really resonated with me when I heard it, from being on the streets and being at those protests, whether it's the Black Lives Matters march or the climate crisis marches. Like, most of the people I think probably who have seen this film and sort of have welcomed it have probably been on a protest before. And that phrasing of annoyance is so annoying, because you're like, the whole point of a protest is to be annoying. Like, that is it. You want to raise your voice. You want to get your body in the way. You want to kind of say things. And what's so sort of absurd when I see that phrase is that, do they not realize that the opposite of what we're protesting for is not just annoying when you're being persecuted, or annoying that you can't have abortion, or annoying that you have racist abuse? Like, it's harmful and it hurts and it is an attack on yourself. So I'm sorry if you can't get your car out of Westminster, but like, you have to do it, because the opposite reaction is like total nightmare situation for people. So it's the most frustrating sentence in that whole thing, because it's the purpose to be annoying.
The point of a protest is to be annoying. Like, that's the whole point. I remember at my kids' school, the teachers went on strike, and one of the elements of the striking, like they were working to rule, was that they wouldn't hand out the newsletters anymore at the door. They were going to send them to us by email. And I remember my husband being like, you realise you're meant to inconvenience us, not convenience us with your protest. I'd much rather receive it via email.
But that's a very good example, I think, of how the powers that be powerful, whoever and wherever they are, and in fact they're generally exactly the same everywhere, but and the same kind of people who are doing it. But it is to curb and to limit and to restrict and to contain. I hate seeing when the police in the UK are kettling people, but at the same time, I think it is absolutely the key, or the key image of what it is to curb people's fundamental freedom. And I think that for so many people, the right to raise your voice can feel as if it's the only right you have. That, that's the only thing you can do, is to either march in the street or raise your voice or bang a drum or beat a path to your local TD's door and so on. And that anything that is curbing, anything that sets out to curb that is an absolute affront to our fundamental humanity. And I've been watching the policing bill in the UK and thinking of what it is doing, and when it came out at the time of the conversation around Sarah Everard's death, tragic death and so on, but also looking in Ireland and how the COVID regulations and emergency are being used to continue curbs on our limits on our freedom of assembly and of speech. Now it's a light touch, but it is still a touch. And I mean, I am prepared to protest for the right to protest.
Mm-hmm. That is so vital, Ailbhe, because I do feel that one of the things about this conversation about the right to protest is that we've got to talk about it as a feminist issue itself, Yeah. I think it's often, given that one of the things that is so vivid in recent memory is the way in which the policing of the Sarah Everard protest took place, right? And the policing of some of the sections of the Black Lives Matter protest took place.
Yes.
This is one issue that we ought to be able to come together on, across the divides, across the various social movements, because it is so fundamental to movements for social justice, movements for equality, whatever the sectional interests are that you represent. Nevertheless, it crosses all those divides. And I do feel that one of the things that we've got to talk about when we talk about, say, the policing bill is not how can we as feminists put some stuff in there that will help women. It's about fundamentally tackling the fact that this is a huge curb on our democratic right. And who is it who's going to be in the front line of any assault that takes place? Women, you know, as well as other vulnerable groups. And so one of the frustrations for me is that, you know, the feminist voice hasn't been loud enough to say that feminism is about safeguarding democratic rights, not just women's rights. Women's rights are, it is about standing up for democratic rights too. So, you know, making those connections is really, really important. And that's why the right to protest should be right at the top of our priority list. And one of the things that upsets me and really terrifies me actually is what we're seeing around the world, where authoritarianism is on the rise. And the way in which civic society spaces are shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And there's all sorts of assaults on people's rights. And the last thing that you can do when the law is against you, when the police are against you, when other institutions are against you, is to protest on the streets, is to be able to raise your voice. But when that is also taken away from you, there is nothing left. And that's why it's so vital. That's why it's so important. And I think, you know, we really have to talk about it as a feminist issue as well as a civil rights issue.
And with the point on it's like sort of like the last straw, like when the laws are against you, when the institutions are against you, when the politicians are against you, the last straw is to have your physical self in a place in visibility. It also comes to me as the concern that we've all been facing around how social media as a platform for communication, this idea of like you're speaking to your void, you're speaking to your kind of tunnel, because if you're saying to your mates, this is terrible, why is this happening, what's going on here, you're just speaking to a group of humans that probably mirror your own opinions. Whereas when you get in front of that big Rolls Royce in Kensington, or you stand in Parliament Square, no matter who's covering it in the press, at least they're talking about it. Even if it's the wrong version of a write-up, or they're not saying things in the way that you probably want them to be displayed in the press, at least they're saying, these people stood outside here to talk about X. And so whether or not they write it up in a nice way or a horrible way in some different papers, at least they're talking about it. Because in kind of silo social media conversations, you can just be speaking to all the people who agree with you for the whole time, and no one's going to kind of make a difference that goes through. So it's such a important thing to retain. Also, to your point, Pragna, before we get to a point where we end up in an authoritarian state and things get worse, it's like if we don't protect this particular point, we can go in such a worse direction kind of as an organisation, which is there. And just where are we at then in terms of the status of the bill, like the conversation to date? Like, is it horrible, murky waters? What's the status since it's been introduced at the moment?
Well, the status of the bill is that it very unfortunately for the government was being debated the week of the Sarah Everard when her body was actually found, and so immediately they ran into a not just national story but a global story of protest. That definitely made them, I think, feel very, very nervous in the initial phases. However, it's currently at its committee stage in Westminster, which is the bit where everybody starts trying to amend it a million times. And some of that will be to take some of those bits out without question. The Conservative government, they will, as far as they're concerned, have played a blinder, because in the same bill is things around how child rapists will be handled in the court. And so to vote against the bill, they say, I have already been accused, somebody who's dedicated most of my life to trying to get better services for people who've been raped, of not caring about child rape victims. And that is the dangerous territory. But, they can say it all they like, because the reality is that I know, I can sleep completely well at night. But it will then come back. It will pass The Conservative government have a majority of 90, and I cannot see a backbone amongst the people who sit on their benches to dissent against it. However, when it goes to the Lords, the right to protest will be writ large in it once again. And the Lords, I imagine, it's one of those fundamentals, actually. It's one of the fundamentals that I think that the Lords will not give in on until the very, that the government will have to concede in the end, because there are a couple of things where it's amazing that our unelected house that we might all like to protest against, that's like the only theocracy outside of Iran, is the thing I always end up relying on. This is not when I was on political protests as a teenager, where I thought my political career would end with relying on the Bishop of Birmingham, but here we are. The reality is, it's one of those sorts of fundamentals where it isn't about money, where the Lords will properly dig in. And they're very big on civil liberties, very, very, very strong on the rule of law. So I imagine that's at the point, I think, that we start properly protesting that is at that argy-bargy end of the argument. But who knows? I'm afraid to say, and Pragna is absolutely right, the fundamental of the bill is wrong, full stop. Doesn't matter what else is in it. Doesn't matter if they give me everything that I want in it. None of that matters. Doesn't matter if they say, all right, rape victims do matter more than statues. Jess, you were right. It doesn't matter about any of that if the fundamental is undermined. However, at the moment, I am in the negative headspace, I think, where I think that the fundamental will be completely undermined. And so you've got to try and get some crumbs along the way. But they have a big majority of not very activated people. So it's hard to say.
And this was also because...
It is sad.
No, I'm just thinking it's so sad, because when I think of the many sad things that have happened for the UK of late, I mean, this
it's
certainly...
Quite the charge sheet, Ailbhe. It's quite the charge sheet.
It is, exactly. But I do think there is something about the nature of control that is achieved through a strict policing bill that you would think, quite honestly, people would be a lot more wary of, because it also actually undermines trust in the police. Interestingly, there's a kind of ironic thing there, but I do think that's very sad. I mean, it's not that Ireland is, millions of miles better than the UK, although it is at the moment just a bit, actually. We have a lot of problems to overcome. But I think, I honestly don't think that we have a centrist government, it's a coalition government, and I honestly don't think that they would have the impertinence and the brass neck to try and get a policing bill of that kind through in Ireland. But it also shows how really important it is for people not to take that line down in the UK and not to try and fight it just on social media. I mean, okay, it's not my generation, I know, but I really do think that while there's a role for social media to express protest, you don't win that way. You win by going out and standing in front of Leinster House, which is where our Parliament meets, or outside Westminster, and you say, we're not going away until you give us what we want, and we're going to make a very great deal of noise. And yes, we are going to stop the traffic because we're Extinction Rebellion, and you are annoying us very much. So I think that there is something about bringing people back to that feet on the street. And if Sarah doesn't mind, if I could pop back to Pragna and ask her a question. You were saying, we have to come together as, and have this as a feminist issue. And I mean, there is a bunch of us here in Ireland who have put together a group called Ailbhe Diversity Not Division, which means together, diversity not division. And we're doing a rally at the end of the month, and it'll all be socially distanced and masked and so on. But it will be a rally, and it will be feet out there on the street. But, are you hopeful? We have a lot of women involved in it, and the crew from United Against Racism and the LGBTs and so on and so forth. So are you hopeful that can happen in the UK, bringing women together across all that divides us? to really try and focus on it. I see a teenager there in the background. sorry. Quick flip.
Am I hopeful? I think we have to be hopeful. We have to be hopeful. We've got to try very, very hard to come together and to, you know, find a way of coming together on the streets. I went on the policing bill, kill the bill demonstration. By the way, that slogan reminds me of the 80s slogan when they were bringing in the police bill then, which had all sorts of very oppressive, you know, measures in it. And what was interesting about Kill the Bill is probably much more the march a few months ago was much more diverse than I thought it would be, but it should have been bigger than I thought it, than it was. It should have been all the women who are out on the marches around the Sarah Everard. They should have all been there. All the Black Lives Matter groups should have been there. You know, it's an opportunity to come together and to find ways of connecting with joining the dots in terms of the different social movements. Because what have we all got in common? That we need to protest if we want to achieve change. That's what we got in common. We should have been there. And it was sad. I mean, it was more diverse than I've seen it, but it wasn't good enough, I felt. But coming back to your point, Ailbhe, about, you know, social media, isn't it interesting? Social media has the ability to harness power, our power, and get us on the streets in no time at all. And social media can also be a problem because you can click a button and think you're being active, and that's not enough. It's, as you say, to get, you know, feet on the street. And I think one of the most heartening things I saw recently really brought tears to my eyes, tears of joy actually, was the ways in which the protesters stopped those men from being deported in Glasgow.
Oh,
if
yes.
you remember, there was that immigration raid that took place, and all these people used social media, got out there and said, there's this raid taking place. And people said, he's my neighbor. They're our neighbors. You're not taking them. And within hours, they were released. Mm-hmm. And, you know, one of the things about that visibility is that the government wants to do things, but it has to be careful about being too visible, about being oppressive. And I think this is where we call them out. And it's only by being visible on the streets that you can call them out, not through social media alone. And that's why I am hopeful, Ailbhe. I am hopeful because, you know, that was groups of people that came out and decided that, you know, they needed to do something spontaneously, and it had a wonderful impact. We did something not so long ago, a few years ago, part of the hostile environment that the government, successive governments actually have introduced around immigration, was that they decided that if they went around in these vans that said go home and paraded them all over the country, or particularly towns and cities, people would get frightened and go home, right? So they had these things that said, you know, are you here illegally? Go home, you know, slogans on these vans, which they drove through largely ethnic minority populations. And part of that was also carrying out loads and loads of immigration raids at the same time. And in Southall, there were immigration raids taking place against, of businesses, shops, retailers, and at transport hubs, people were being stopped arbitrarily and being asked to produce their identity cards and things. A lot of the women that come to us have insecure immigration status. Doesn't mean they're illegal, but they don't know what their status is. We're trying to regularize it. So they were really frightened of being stopped. And then they came to us one day, right, and said, there's these vans outside a shopping center in Southall, and there are raids going on. So we took our loudhailers immediately and ran to the shopping mall and started to expose what was going on. And people crowded and said, what's going on? And we said, there's an immigration raid going on, and we're trying to stop it, and made just a hell of a noise around it, which suitably embarrassed the immigration officers, and then they had to stop and they had to go away and so on. And so I think that, you know, the social media thing is a real problem because, you know, you have to have those feet on the streets.
But also, I think that our bodies matter. Our bodies physically on the streets, especially if you're a feminist campaigner, like so much of it is about your physical body, like the things that people think about it, the things people have done to it. And that if you don't make like, it doesn't have to be millions of people, but you have to make an image. And so when you say you're going to cry, Ailbhe, at the image of those women on the bridge, I constantly, when people say, well, what can I do? There is something so important about and that Glasgow thing, like them all crowding around that van, like sitting on the floor. It creates like an amazing image that will stay with the viewer, like Syrian child on the beach. And you cannot do that without a human body to tell a human story. When in the home to vote thing, as part of the abortion referendum, all the women with their walking around London with their suitcases and the noise that the suitcases made on the pavements in the videos, it's like mesmerizing, the feeling of like a rumbling change. Like, you have to use your body to make a change. I was pissed off because my school shut on a Friday afternoon because they didn't have funding, and in Prime Minister's question times I just accidentally threatened to leave my kid at Downing Street, and then I was like, I'm sorry, Danny, he was the one you just saw walk past. I was like, I have to leave you here. The image of me having no childcare and having to leave you on the doorstep, I don't need millions of people. It's just, you've got to get an image that the country can see and feel is a moment of noise, like is the rumbling of the things. And our bodies matter much more than that bloody tweet. And as somebody who receives the clicktivism,
yes,
whilst we've been on this call, I will have people telling me about grouse shooting, about there'll be all sorts of things about whatever is being debated in Parliament. I will be being asked to go to every single thing, and it's too delicious for people to be like, oh yeah, I care about that, oh I care about that. We've got to get out and show ourselves, and that's what changed it in Ireland. Nobody can watch any of that without being like, oh God, there's
something else that differentiates, getting out on the streets from social media. Yes, I mean, I absolutely agree about social media getting us out there. Fantastic organizing tool. It can also be a hugely divisive tool as well. It organizes with the one hand and it divides with the other. But but the thing about, and so many women, and young women, older women, during repeal, after repeal, it's that thing of getting out there and feeling your physical power on the street. And you don't ever forget that. I mean, hopefully we all forget most of the tweets we ever had to do, because it's just nonsense that you can say anything really, really intelligent in that kind of environment. But, you don't want to remember that, but you remember the time that you protested against this thing or that thing or the other. I can remember myself standing in various places and absolutely erupting with rage and emotion and anger and probably wanting actually to throttle everybody, and very grateful that I was surrounded by all these women. We were all walking together. But so I do think that's really important, because it's the body and it's the voice. But when Pragna was speaking there, I love the way casually, you probably noticed that, Sarah and Jess, we got our loudhailers and we took up. So these are women who are equipped with loudhailers. I like this.
Yes, absolutely.
But that's what I think. That's a real protesting woman. She has a loudhailer effectively at home.
Ready for that at all times.
I want us to put bills to our government saying loudhailers for all women. Loudhailers for all.
Something like a first aid kit. You have to have a loudhailer next to you, ready to move.
It's just that casual way.
Yeah.
That Pragna you didn't weave it in. It was just part of and I'm thinking there is also something about protests that if it gets hold of you, I'm just saying this also for anybody who's seen the film and who has maybe gets bitten by the bug. It is a bug. It does bite you. And I have to tell you, it never, ever, ever leaves you. Because people sometimes say to me, oh, well, are you still fighting for whatever? And I say, yeah, well, I mean, we haven't resolved the problem. So of course I'm still fighting. I say, do you mean I should not be? And they say, well, you know, you're supposed to be retired. And you say, well, there's no retiring from equality, because it never really leaves you, does it?
No,
it's like a drug.
I think also I think it's the body, it's the power, but it's also inspirational. Right? You know, watching what happened in Ireland, it cannot fail to move you. It cannot fail to make you think, wow, I wish I was there. And I wasn't. I wish I was part of that. And I want to do something like that next, you know, if we have an opportunity here. And it's the same when you see Chilean women, you know, against rape, or the Polish women protesting against the, you know, the attack on their rights in the most appalling circumstances, or the Indian women, you know, that came out after the rape case in Delhi. You know, these are inspirational moments too. They're about, and I do think there are so many women that sit, and perhaps even others who are friends of feminists, or men who see themselves as feminists, who sit there going, I want to be part of that. I really want to be a part of that. And I think that you know, the other thing for me is, I know protest works when the harder they try to put you down, you know, and you know you must be doing something right because it's really threatening. And I experienced that when in 1989, 1990, when Salman Rushdie had the fatwa issued against him. And some of us, spearheaded by Southall Black Sisters, but involving women from many different diverse religious backgrounds, formed Women Against Fundamentalism. And our first act of protest was to go to Parliament Square and protest against the anti-Rushdie demonstrators, right, who were mobilized by Muslim fundamentalists. So there was thousands upon thousands upon thousands of men, young men, few women right at the end, but largely a sea of thousands of young, fanatical young men calling for Rushdie's death because he dared to blaspheme and write this, you know, book. And we stood there as women with our Women Against Fundamentalists placard saying, religious leaders don't speak for us, here to stay, here to fight, women's struggle, you know, women's tradition, struggle, not submission, you know, here to stay, here to doubt, you know, all these kind of placards. And it's probably the most terrifying protest I've ever been on, because there was just 40 of us deciding that we had to take a stance against what we saw was rising fundamentalism. And it was, you know, it was about that one in particular, but we were against all fundamentalists in all religions. But they came for us. They lunged at us. They saw us, women, standing there in colorful clothes to sort of, you know, celebrate the joy of being women, the joy of life. And they came for us, and they tried to attack us and pull down our banners and called us whores and prostitutes and all sorts of things. And ironically, it was the police who formed a cordon between us and them, and that saved our lives. It saved us seriously from harm and possibly our lives. At the same time, there was a group of fascists who turned up, far-right fascists who turned up, and who came to also to protest against the marches for their own reasons, for their own racist reasons, but then realizing that we were the easier target, lunged at us and did their sort of Heil Hitler salutes and were chanting fascist and racist slogans. So one minute we were saying down with fundamentalism, then we're turning and saying down with racism, you know, down with fascism. But that moment for me will forever, you know, remain in my mind and, you know, till the day I die, because I felt that we must be doing something right as women, that they found us so threatening, so absolutely threatening, you know. And I think that is really, really important, to challenge the right of these people, the powers that be, to speak for us, or to and to challenge their legitimacy. You know, these are really, really important things that protest does, I feel.
And there's something really nice about what you say with that story, Pragna, that also, like, no voice is too small. Like, some people would have looked at that and said, there are thousands of guys there. What on earth are 40 ladies rocking up going to do? But you made a mark and you made a voice. And I think so many in our society are worried, like, will it matter if it's just one more person? Will it matter if I head down with my friends? Like, if I can get my mate to come with me, will it make a difference? Yes, it will, because it's that one extra body, especially when we're fighting for protection of our own bodily autonomy. Like, the best thing you can do is get your body out there to sort of take a stand against it. So it's really kind of a great reminder to us all that kind of you might be the only voice to start with, and you might be the only person also in your group of friends. Because I've also had moments of sort of protest within friendship circles where someone's saying something completely out of order, and you have to be the person who goes, it's totally out of order. Like, no, like, what are you talking about? And in a way, you're having this like mini protest in your kind of social circle. But if you let that weird comment slide or that off suggestion, you're like, absolutely not. You've got to be that voice. And it's starting from those very small interactions of kind of making your voice heard that's really, really important to kind of come through. As I say that, anyone in the audience who also would like to have their voice heard, we've got time for a couple of questions before we wrap up. So if you want to add any questions into the chat box, I'd love to know where you're from as well, tuning in. And we've had a great question come in from Caroline, who's tuning in from the International Planned Parenthood Europe in the Belgium office. So welcome, Caroline. And she's put a really great question. I'd love to hear thoughts from one of the panels. So, in supporting abortion movements in Europe and globally, we often see tensions arise between more traditional civil society organisations and newer social movements. But to win, we need both sides to work together. Has anyone got any advice on how to manage these tensions and keep these unlikely partnerships together to be strong and impactful? I wonder, Ailbhe, have you got any of that? Because that must have happened in the repeal campaign.
Well, I mean, I think one of the reasons that we were ultimately successful, and people do say, oh, you won so fast. It just came. I'm thinking, no, it didn't. It was 35, 40 years. But anyway, we started off five years when Savita Halappanavar died because she was refused an abortion when she was having a septic pregnant miscarriage. At that time, after the legislation came in, then was very minimal. A few of us got together and said, what we've got to do is actually bring everybody together, which is why I was kind of interested to ask Pragna what she thinks, because we spent several years actually building that platform, that coalition, bringing people together from really different social movements, but not just social movements, also more, not establishment, but nonetheless NGOs and other sorts of areas, and bringing everybody together and saying, okay, we may not all agree exactly on how abortion should be managed, so to speak, and delivered in Ireland, but we do agree that the Eighth Amendment has to go. And by the time we came to the end of the campaign, that was a really, really, really strong coalition. And in fact, the campaign itself was fought by it emerged from that by three organisations: the coalition itself, the Abortion Rights Campaign, the National Women's Council of Ireland, who were sort of left centre, so to speak. But we managed to bring everybody together. But it was incredibly hard work. It really, really, really was. I mean, people sometimes say to me, would you do that again? And I really wouldn't. I think you can build one coalition in your life. You definitely can't build two. It is difficult. And it only works if you can frame the cause you're fighting for in very clear and explicit ways and kind of refuse to go off-piste. You can't do that. You've got to stay focused on the cause. I think a little bit of that maybe comes through in the film. But there are some positive repercussions. There are also some that are negative afterwards. I mean, many women feel, and I do myself, that it didn't go nearly far enough. Other women felt understandably left out or marginalised, and that's particularly true for women of colour. It's particularly true for women with disabilities. It is particularly true for a number of different groups who felt that their voices were not the strongest in the campaign or were really quite silent. So I certainly learned a lot from doing it as well, but it's a really hard thing to do. But it works. So it's worth it.
And you must find that as, sorry, Pragna, do you have a note?
No, I was just going to say, I think protest kind of conjures up this idea of spontaneous kind of, acts of civil disobedience. It takes years to plan and organize often, not the ones around, the Glasgow example or whatever, but some of the ones, certainly the one that Ailbhe's talking about, and some of the others that, I've been involved in. I mean, I think the thing about protests is you're in it for the long run, right? It is about, chipping away, working away, laying foundations, losing things, battles along the way. But actually, even the failures, and we were discussing that earlier, weren't we, Jess? Even failures ultimately are not failures because they're laying the foundations of something. They're creating awareness. You're creating awareness. You're building. The next, it might not be you, but the next generation will come along and hopefully be able to galvanize some, and bring together what you weren't able to. But the foundations are there. So I think that it is about being, these are not quick fixes sometimes. They will take years to work at. And there can be such hard work as which is a revelation, hearing about all the behind the scenes stuff that's going on. Ailbhe, to me, still inspirational, but eyes open. It's hard work, and I think that's important for people to understand. And I think the real hard work is afterwards, isn't it, Ailbhe? It's how do we keep it going?
We're fighting at the moment in Ireland to get, actual delivery of what the law says women can access. And of course, as usual, it is the most women who are in the most fragile and excluded and marginalized situation who have least access. I mean, we still have a woman basically traveling to Britain every day for an abortion. But I was thinking a little bit earlier. I mean, just when you were talking, Jess, you said something about all the work that you've done around violence against women. That I do think to myself, particularly, well, pre-COVID, of course, but post-COVID, when the numbers have gone up so astronomically, not just in the UK, not just in Ireland, around the world. That we have to do something on a global level. I don't know if you've thought about that. I mean, I just think we have to do something about the violence. We just have to stop it. We have to.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. And I do feel like, and I don't know whether this is just the triumph of hope over experience. Pragna is absolutely right. She and I have been fighting for a number of years now. For marginalised women, migrant women, to be essentially, we just want them to be treated the same way that I would be as a British woman. It doesn't seem like a big ask, but every year we've made slight progress, and in those moments of slight progress, the more traditional, as the question refers to, the more traditional. I wouldn't say, I'd say most of civil society actually has been on our side regardless in this regard, but the more traditional media in our country, so the Sun newspaper in the United Kingdom came out on mine and Pragna's side, much to mine and Pragna's surprise at the time. But she, whilst the government reneged a bit on a few things and didn't renege fully, we'll slip. And I don't know in my lifetime whether we'll ever stop the violence, but I know in my lifetime that we will end the no recourse to public funds for victims of domestic violence. I am absolutely certain that we will do it eventually, Pragna. But I think that, I have to be hopeful that COVID-19 and the way that everybody had a universal experience in the country of for the first time, rather than just saying it, like actually checking their privilege. So people would say things like, I can't see my family and that's rubbish, but at least I'm safe in my home. At least I'm not living with an abuser. At least my kids are safe. And there was a sort of outbreak of an understanding and the political heating up of the issue of domestic abuse and sexual violence and violence against women and girls in all of its forms. It's sort of, whether it raised up here, but it elevated, it definitely has got elevated. And the government now in the UK wouldn't put out a budget, for example, that didn't say, I mean, what they put in the budget was absolutely useless, but it did mention domestic abuse. Like it's there as an ever-present force that if they don't mention it, they know there is people there, they're going to go, why didn't you mention domestic abuse? And that is, I think that's the first step to some manner of just upping the politics globally.
So long. We've been at this for so long.
I mean, part of me just thinks, sometimes I do just think, just give up, love. You ain't never going to manage it. And then I'm like, come on.
Never give up.
Oh, well, the reason we'll never give up is we get too angry when we see things happening. You know, it's the anger that drives, you know, I would think most of us, right? It's that, you know, even when you sort of think you're tired and well, I actually get more angry than upset. I get upset, of course, but it's the anger that makes me think, oh shit, I've got to do something, got to get out there and say something, you know. And what you said, Sarah, about, you know, how important it is to be the one that says something, even when it's unpopular, you know. And you know that you might not get any support from anywhere, but to be able to stand up and say it, because that's half the battle. Is
in standing up for what you do, Pragna, in standing up to the government that funds your organisation is absolutely phenomenal. And sometimes I'll be in meetings and I think, she might have gone too far. I'm like that. Oh God! Like, she's going to take all their money away. Like, as I'm like, oh God, what if I've incited the end of Southall Black Sisters?
Well, you know, they give us money, silencing us. No way. I mean, that's the thing about how to play the system, but not be co-opted and not
never be grateful for your rights.
Yeah, and never ever let them think that because they give you money that buys your silence.
Yes, exactly. Or that to be nice to them in return. I mean, I think that thing of, I think we all say it to us as, oh, geez, I've really gone over the line here. I better calm down a little bit here. I've gone too far. We've gone too far. Or if we go too far. And then the sensible part of me says, no, actually, you haven't gone too far. The point is, we can never go far enough because there is such a huge gap. The problem is that those who are opposed to us are just nowhere near having sufficient understanding. So, I mean, we have to go further than sometimes we might think is that. And I think women suffer from that. It's too far, it's too much thing. And one of the things that's bothering me at the moment is I do think whenever you have a victory, there is a kind of a backlash. And there's also an attempt to co-opt and so on. And I have noticed in Ireland that increasingly the word advocacy is being used, where what we actually mean is activism. You know, people will say, Ailbhe Smyth is a campaigner. And I'll say, yes, I'm an activist, actually. Or they leave out the word feminist, or they'll forget I'm a lesbian, or, you know, all those tiny little ways. And you can't always be sitting there saying, well, I'm a feminist as well, and I'm a lesbian, and I'm an activist. I mean, you can't do that, but you've got to find a way of introducing these words into it.
Ailbhe, just teacher, feminist, lesbian, activist. I wear it all times.
I'm going to get a t-shirt. I'm getting a t-shirt, Jess. I'm all of these things, or whatever we happen to be. I mean, I'm using myself as an example, but I'm getting a little bit annoyed and worried about that's another way of curbing us. It is another way of curbing us by calling us by more. We'll make you polite. We'll civilize you somehow. And I'm thinking, no, actually, if I'm not upsetting them, I'm not making a difference.
Yeah.
On the other side of that coin, though, is what I'm thinking about some people who might be listening in who maybe haven't protested much in their career, haven't protested much in their life. And actually, for them, maybe some of those labels feel quite abrasive. And but if they can say, actually, I spoke loudly this weekend, like they might use a different language to say that they like took part. So I think that's also something really interesting for the audience to reflect on, is that protesting is whatever form you choose it to be, whether it's in your circle of friends, whether it's outside Westminster, whether it's you're the one kid in your school that shows up in a different uniform because you don't like the rules, like whatever it is, protest is what you make it to be in your own kind of area. And that's what I think I love about the film in general. Showcases so many different versions of protesting, so many different versions.
I love Andrea's protesting, where she calls herself a glitter activist, and she was stupendous and phenomenal, and went out and gathered together all these young women who'd never thought of protest wasn't really in their vocabulary, and she just transformed them into activists, and spent quite a long time saying, I'm not really an activist. I'm saying, sorry, I don't really care what you think you are really or not. You are. You are an activist. Embrace it. But I think she's a really good example of that, actually, isn't she, Sarah?
Just kind of doing it your own way. Now, I feel that we could just talk for literally hours about these sort of things. It was so fascinating to hear your experience, and it's so lovely to also hear it from such different angles of society. And Jess, I also feel like you must feel like you're processing every day at work, because you're just like, listen to me.
Imagine what your life is like if you don't just have to sit outside the building. Imagine if your daily life is literally sits in the room with them and not want to be like, for fuck's sake!
Yeah.
Well, as they say in Ireland, more power to your left elbow, Jess.
I think I'm going to go actually mad if I have to sit through this.
Okay. Well, I want to say thank you so much for all of your time. That was such a wonderful conversation. I feel like I've learnt loads as a protester anyway, but like getting out in the streets. And I really, really hope like everyone who's been listening to this, like process in your way, like find your way, find your voice, find your issue. It doesn't have to be abortion rights in Ireland, whatever it is. When you are annoyed, raise your voice, make yourself heard. Make sure that you go and have your body in the way, because we cannot make these changes unless we are physically there. And I think for Ailbhe and Pragna, who've been in this fight for decades now, kind of using your feet, it's also up to us as a younger generation of kind of women and men and other people coming together to kind of take up this fight now and kind of take charge. So thank you, Pragna, Jess and Ailbhe. That was such a wonderful conversation, and look forward to do this again sometimes. This was fun.
Thank you. It was wonderful being with my heroes. Thank you.
It was lovely to see you.
Bye, ladies.
Bye, everybody.